This week, big story out of Rome. His Eminence Robert Sarah is no longer head of the Vatican's Office on Liturgy and the Sacraments. Pope Francis accepted his resignation upon reaching the retirement age of 75. But other cardinals have gone on to serve well beyond that. Cardinal Sarah of Ghana is still a voting member of the College of Cardinals. So what does this move tell us about the Pope's ongoing curial reform? And who will replace Sarah? Joining me now with in-depth analysis is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD MURRAY. Thank you both for being here. I want to begin with your reactions to Pope Francis accepting the resignation of Cardinal Robert Sarah. He's long been considered a possible candidate for Pope in the next conclave, and his views on sexuality, celibacy, and the liturgy have often been at odds or seemed at odds with those of Pope Francis. Here's what the Cardinal himself had to say via Twitter earlier this week. He said, "Today the Pope accepted my resignation of my office as Prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship after my 75th birthday. I am in God's hands. The only rock is Christ. We will meet again very soon in Rome and elsewhere." Father Jerry, now Pope Francis continues to reshape and reform the Curia, the College of Cardinals. After the last consistory, Francis has appointed 57% of those cardinal electors. My question is, what message might this be sending, not keeping Cardinal Sarah in place? Father Jerry.
I think it's fair to say that Pope Francis had some disagreements with Cardinal Sarah. Those have been noted during the time that the cardinal was in charge of the Congregation for Sacraments and Worship. On the other hand, he did reach age 75, so that's when cardinals do send in their resignation. So there's nothing irregular about this. It's not a removal for cause, let's say. But we do know that Cardinal Sarah has a great influence in the church because of his profound spirituality, his vigorous defense of Catholic doctrine, and his challenge to the secular West. I mean, here is a cardinal from Africa who has come to be one of the prime defenders of Christ and his church in the face of hostility in the Western world. So I think we're going to see and hear Cardinal Sarah continuing to speak. And I certainly wish him, well in his retirement. But as we've seen with other Roman cardinals, when they retire, they're often busier than they were before.
Yeah. Bob, we reported early last year that Cardinal Sarah encountered controversy over that book he wrote, Defending Priestly Celibacy. At the same time, Francis was considering a relaxation to the rule. And then you remember Pope Benedict was wrapped up in that. They said he'd collaborated with Cardinal Sarah on the book. Did that episode doom Cardinal Sarah, in your opinion? And what kind of man do you believe will be chosen to replace him at that congregation?
Well, I agree with Father Murray that it's fair to say that there's long been a difference of opinion, even you might say something of a conflict between the two visions. The Pope very much a kind of a Western internationalist, Cardinal Sarah very much in that traditional African mode. So whether that book was, the last straw, I don't really know. It was a bitter controversy and an oddity in a way, because I think both the Pope and Cardinal Sarah in particular, I think is a great gentleman. They kind of went out of their way not to conflict with one another. And yet at the same time, even prior to that book, as we know, some years ago, basically the entire staff of that Congregation for Divine Worship was replaced, which meant that Cardinal Sarah was pretty much lonely at the top with a group of subordinates who were not sympathetic to his way of doing things anyway. Look, this is, as Father says, this is not unusual. There wasn't an immediate removal, as sometimes happens when somebody just turns 75 and they're sort of immediately put out to pasture. There was almost a year that they waited. We'll see what happens, but I also think that this is going to give Cardinal Sarah a chance to be even more active than he was in the past. He's not going to have those responsibilities in the Curia, and he's still a very vigorous, very healthy, and I think spiritually powerful figure.
Yeah, and everyone I talk to, it seems he's still papably, in the running for the papacy, should he, should that moment come upon him. Speaking of reshaping the Curia, Pope Francis has stepped up his outreach to women in church leadership, recently appointing French sister Nathalie Biquart, named her undersecretary of the Synod of Bishops. Now, this is a major first, as she will have voting rights in the next synod. Pope Francis also named Katia Samaria as promoter of justice for the appeals court of the Vatican city-state. How significant are these appointments, Father Jerry, particularly having that sister being a voting member of this synod?
Well, they are significant in and of themselves because lay people and then lay women in this case are being promoted to roles formerly held by bishops and priests. The fact that they have a voting role, this is an anomaly because it was never conceived when the rules were written that there would be a lay person occupying that position. And if it is a synod of bishops, it makes no sense for non-bishops to have voting rights. Now, the synod is merely consultative. It's not a decision-making body. It doesn't carry any jurisdictional power. So it can advise the Pope, and if the Pope is within his rights to give voting rights to people who aren't bishops. But I don't think it makes sense theologically to go that way. Now, another question we really have to face is it good for lay people to be assuming roles that, in properly understood, belong to clerics? This is what we've been warned about, the clericalization of the laity, that they only have importance in the church if they do the things that priests and bishops have done in the past. And I'm very hesitant about that. I think this is confusing. Lay people are the vast majority in the life of the church, but they are not the shepherds. Christ chose the apostles and their successors of the shepherds. So to give people the idea you only count if you have some kind of shepherdly role, not a good idea, in my opinion.
Bob, very quickly, your take on this.
Yeah, I agree. At the last synod, I think it was the one on youth, there were several congregations of women who were represented there. And this question came up, why should they be allowed to participate in the deliberations and yet not have a role in voting? Well, as Father rightly says, this is a synod of bishops. And if you want to redefine this, if you want to take that body of consultation that the Pope assembles every now and then and make it into something else, well, then I think you have to give it a different name. But if it's going to be a synod of bishops, it should be bishops who have been designated in the theological way that Father was talking about that are actually making these decisions. We know that this is a way of kind of introducing women into more and more roles. I don't myself think that this is going to satisfy anybody. It's a step in the direction that lots of people would like to see the church move, but it's not going to be the end. It's going to be the beginning, and it's clearly kind of a camel's nose under the tent.
Moving elsewhere in Europe, the German bishops continue their so-called synodal way, which ostensibly gives the laity more shared responsibility in church leadership in Germany. Now, the German bishops released a letter called Power and Separation of Powers in the Church, Common Participation and Sharing in the Mission. Here's a little excerpt. The goal is to guarantee the shared responsibility and participation of all the faithful in both deliberative and decision-making processes. Sounds familiar. It is also necessary to readjust the constitutional structure of the church in order to strengthen the rights of the faithful in the governance of the church. Now, Father Jerry, I know you've written a piece about this. Give me your sense in the Catholic thing this week, your thoughts on where the German church seems to be going here.
In the column that I wrote, I said this can only be called an attempt at self-destruction because this document is revolutionary. It basically casts aside everything that the Catholic Church has understood about herself right from the beginning, that we are founded by Christ on the apostles. The apostles were sent out to preach the gospel, and that there is a hierarchical structure, that you have a guiding role in the church through sacramental ordination. This document basically wants lay people to take control. They want to make offices in the church subject to election and even recall. It's a wild document. It basically undermines doctrine, morality, and it puts the Catholic Church on a footing with, a self-governing Protestant church in which everybody gets to vote on who's going to be their leaders. This is a very dangerous document, and it's very distressing that bishops are putting their name to something which, if this had been brought before Pope Pius XII or Paul VI, this would have been immediately condemned. And I hope the same thing happens now that it's made public. Rome needs to condemn these ideas. We can't play around with fire because houses burn down, and we don't want the church in Germany to burn down.
Yeah. Now, Bob, do they have the authority to seed the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church in their country?
Yeah, well, this is what's hilarious. From what I understand from friends in Germany, this is a small but very vocal, radical group. And as often happens with these kind of groups outside of the church as well as inside, their influence is disproportionate to their numbers and who they are. I mean, no one who appointed them to make these decisions about a church that is based in truth. I really encourage everyone to read Father Murray's column from the Catholic Thing this week, because he did yeoman service in reading through a document that's pretty painful to read through. What you come up with is an idea of the church. They actually say this. It's going to have diverse interpretations of various things about the Catholic faith, which is to say that it's basically going to become what the secular society is. In other words, there are going to be people in the German church who affirm homosexual marriage, transgenderism, female priests and bishops, abortion. So there will be no distinction whatever on the model that they're proposing between the church and the world. It will just be a church that goes along with the world. Now, you can set a church up like that if you want. You don't really have to set one up in Germany because there are many of them, and they're called Protestant churches.
Well, Bob, this church already exists. It's called the United Nations. I mean, and look, if you join that church, you also don't have to worry about Sunday obligations, fasting, any of those bothersome moral clauses. I mean, I don't see the distinction here. It seems this is an extinction pact. That's what they're talking about. This is writing themselves out of history and out of relevance in society. And I don't know why you would violate your core principles, which I thought was Jesus Christ. Maybe I missed that memo when we jettisoned what that guy was saying.
Also,
but
if Christ
something
came
is
into
off
the world
here.
to save us, if Christ came into the world to save us, and he did, and to bring us the truth about God and ourselves, are we going to have multiple interpretations of these things? Or are we going to submit ourselves to that revelation that God himself has sent to us? They seem to think that truth does not matter, and that what we're going to do is we're going to order our lives by, whatever a majority happens to agree to right now. And by the way, they say, we hope that the minorities will understand that they more or less they have the right to remain silent, is the way I would put it, that they're the ones that get to do the talking. Everyone else is just supposed to go along with what they propose.
Okay, I'm going to move ahead because we've got lots to cover. Pope Francis will be making an ecumenical visit to Iraq in early March. He'll be visiting a devastated Christian community that's still reeling from the Islamic State devastation. Pope Francis told Catholic News Service earlier this month he's making the trip because, quote, I am the pastor of people who are suffering, end quote. He'll also be conducting an historic meeting with a Shiite Muslim leader at the birthplace of Abraham. Father Murray, what does the Pope hope to achieve in Iraq? And his statement there, he's the pastor of people who are suffering. I mean, they're suffering Catholics in China. I don't see them getting much of a side glance, much less a mention these days from Rome.
Well, we'll take the China question up in a minute, but as regards this trip, he definitely is sympathetic to, and really his heart is bleeding for the persecuted Christians in the Middle East. And I think this is his way of showing solidarity, particularly in that area which had been under the Islamic State. Now those Christians in small numbers have returned. They're rebuilding their churches. He wants to show that the chief shepherd is there with his flock. He also wants to show that peaceful relations between Catholics, Muslims, and others is possible in the Middle East and elsewhere. And he's making symbolic gestures by meeting and praying together. What I would say on the China thing, of course, this is a continuing source of frustration. that the complaints of some Catholics are put on the back burner, ignored, whereas others get attention. I think the Pope needs to remind all of us that the Catholics in China who are suffering as a result of the Vatican's deal they deserve a hearing, and they deserve relief from what is in fact a communist oppressive situation.
Bob, you've covered Christian persecution for decades. Your thoughts on this and the importance of this trip to Iraq?
Well, I think it's fine for him to do this. And if it were not for some of the more worrisome statements that he's made about this ecumenical outreach, we all remember that he spoke in that document with the Muslims about God has willed the plurality of religions. And
right.
This is just something that seems to be unconscionable for the leader of the Catholic Church to be saying. That's something that we need to keep an eye on, of course. And we know that there are deep historical tensions in the Middle East, and it's fine to reach out to that. We just want to make sure that that desire to prevent violent conflict right now does not carry everything before it, including the truth claims of Christianity.
I want to move on to some pandemic news. The Vatican issued a decree on February 8th that any Vatican employee that refuses a COVID vaccination would risk being fired. The decree stated that Vatican employees who opt out without a proven medical need risk sanctions up to and including the interruption of the relationship of employment. Later on February 18th, the governor of the Vatican City-State walked that back just a little bit, saying alternative solutions would be found for employees not wishing to be vaccinated. Father, your take on this? This seems to fly in the face of the idea that vaccinations, at this early stage should be voluntary. I mean, is this morally valid? Never mind the human resources aspect of this?
Well, it's a difficult question because you do want to ensure a workplace in which you have minimized the risk to employees of disease being transmitted. So that's a valid moral and good way to act. Now, the question is getting vaccinated the only remedy for this? And I think for the vast majority of people it is, but there have to be exceptions. Let's say you've already had the COVID-19 and that you recovered from it. I'm not clear, because I'm not a scientist, whether you need to be vaccinated or not. I think they're recommending it. And then you also have some people will have concerns regarding their own personal health situation. I think doctors should be able to evaluate those. So I will say, I think as a matter of principle, it is fair and moral for employers, including the church, to require people to have a vaccination in order to guarantee as much as possible a healthy work environment. But there need to be mechanisms for exceptions based on medically reasonable grounds.
Bob, you want to take a quick crack at that?
Yeah, and it was quite odd, that initial statement, because the Vatican is quite allergic to firing anyone. The Vatican finances are very, very fraught right now. There are large deficits year by year that the Vatican experiences. And even so, Pope Francis has made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to fire anyone, even though it looks to outside observers that the Vatican would have to fire something like 1/4 or 1/3 of its employees in order to be solvent. But to put that out there, I wouldn't make too much out of this. A lot of times, I've said on this show before, things that we think are kind of doctrinal often turn out to just be bureaucratic, and then they tend to be clunkily bureaucratic because the internal communications in the Vatican aren't always the best, and there could be a PR gap between one office and another. But for all the reasons that Father said, I mean, this is a difficult question. There's a lot that we don't know about this virus. Individuals have comorbidities, they're vulnerable. I think we want to be prudent in how we deal and be individualistic. We've got to basically recognize that not everybody is in the same situation.
I want to move on to the Senate confirmation hearings going on this week in Washington, D.C. California Attorney General Javier Becerra was President Biden's pick for HHS Secretary. Becerra is a Catholic. He was grilled about his stance on abortion, as well as the state of California's case against the Little Sisters of the Poor. Utah Senator Mitt Romney peppered Becerra with questions about his thoughts on partial birth abortion?
Most people agree that partial birth abortion is awful. You voted against a ban on partial birth abortion. Why?
So, Senator, here, I understand that people have different deeply held beliefs on this issue, and I respect that. I have worked, as I've mentioned, for decades, trying to protect the health of men and women, young and old. And as Attorney General, my job has been to follow the law and make sure others are following the law. I will tell you that I hope to be able to work with you and others to reach that common ground on so many different issues.
Romney gave up and conceded that it didn't seem like common ground would be possible with Becerra. This was mostly a duck and weave operation. Why is Becerra so unwilling as a Catholic to make his position clear, do you think? Father Jerry.
Well, that was a complete non-answer to the question, and it revealed the fact that he's typical of those who take an objectionable action knowing that it betrays what they're supposed to believe in. As a Catholic, you cannot believe that partial birth abortion is good. So for him to claim that he's been working to protect the health of men and women, he's not doing that at all. This was a question about what he voted on. It's unconscionable for him to claim that he was just following the law when in fact he was trying to write the law in a new way by his vote against the partial birth abortion. Statutes have to deal with viability of people, and when someone is in the process of being born, to kill them is to murder them. This is wrong. This is the wrong man for this job for many, many reasons. He has no background in this area, and he did go after the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Hold on, I want to get to that.
Yeah.
I want to get to that.
Okay.
Becerra's probably best known as the Attorney General who went after the Little Sisters. And again, that was to force them to provide abortifacients and contraceptives to their employees. But he seemed to have a different view of history when questioned by John Thune. Watch.
It does seem like, as Attorney General, you spend an inordinate amount of time and effort suing pro-life organizations like Little Sisters of the Poor, or trying to ease restrictions or expand abortion.
See, I understand that Americans have different, deeply held beliefs on this particular issue, and I absolutely respect that. By the way, I have never sued the nuns, any nuns. I have taken on the federal government.
He may want to review this. This is actually the lawsuit. State of California versus Little Sisters of the Poor. Is Becerra saying that he didn't personally sue nuns, Bob? Why is he splitting hairs here? He sued the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Well, you know why he's splitting hairs. It's all these lawyerly answers. I never did this. I never did that. Look, the blame here goes back to President Biden, because he's the one who has put forward a man who has no experience running healthcare, that doesn't belong in the sensitive position that when you're the head of HHS, there are all these moral questions that arise. And so I think that President Biden has to bear the blame for nominating this guy. I've got a column coming out in the next few days because, everybody's been speculating how the president and the Pope, there's a certain synergy to their Catholicism. They care about the environment and about refugees and immigration and the poor. But the Pope has also said that you don't hire a hitman to solve a problem. In other words, somebody to perpetrate an abortion. I think that Javier Becerra is a Catholic hitman.
Well, I'm tickled by the critique here where they say, well, Alex Azar wasn't a doctor either, and he didn't have health, and that's totally wrong. I mean, in this sense, Alex Azar ran Eli Lilly, and thank God that he did, because that allowed Operation Warp Speed to move forward, and he got around so many of the pharmaceutical industries because he knew the territory. What does Becerra know? Aside from being Attorney General of a state, it's a very different skill set. So we'll see how this shakes out. But regarding Catholics in public office, very quickly, I want to get your thoughts on the U.S. bishops' decision to disband their working group on President Biden and how to deal with a Catholic president who so openly defines Catholic teaching. Very quickly, Father Jerry, a good idea.
it was a great idea to have the committee to look at this, because this is a major scandal in the life of the church right now, that a president who talks all the time about how important his Catholicism is to him is using his power now to attack Catholic teaching and cause mayhem in the lives of the unborn and others. Now, the committee, sad to say, has been disbanded, and I was very disappointed when the press spokesman for the U.S. bishops was asked about it, that she had no comment. And I say to myself, no, wait a minute. All we got was that the bishops are now going to have the doctrinal committee issue a statement. Wait a minute. Why did you have a committee in the first place? You could have tasked the doctrinal committee from the start with this. So I regret that it happened. Leadership in this regard is important, and I hope the doctrinal committee will issue a very good statement, because it's quite manifest. A Catholic politician who uses his power to pay for and promote abortion is gravely acting against his faith and against the common good, and he needs to be reminded of that and brought to task. If there's no accountability for that, then basically we're saying, well, the Catholic Church just watches what people does but never tries to correct them.
Mm-hmm. Bob, very quickly, was this due to pressure, do you think, from the Vatican? I know they were displeased with Archbishop Gomez's initial statement after Biden's inauguration.
Yeah, I think that there's an internal struggle going on with the bishops. Some are behind, quite a few are behind Gomez. A few strong voices, Cardinal Supich, Bishop McElroy in San Diego, have, of course, taken an opposite view. Look, we'll see what the doctrinal committee does. The doctrinal committee is headed by Bishop Rhodes of South Bend. He's very good. We'll see if he can get through some good statements, get them into the public realm. And perhaps by divine providence, Bishop Rhodes is the Bishop of South Bend, Indiana, where Notre Dame, we are hearing, is mulling whether to give an honorary degree to Joseph Biden.
Well, we will leave it there. Commentary by Robert Royal and Father Jerry Murray can always be found at thecatholicthing.org. Thank you, gents.